Professor Regnerus is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a Research Associate of the university's Population Research Center and a Senior Fellow at the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. He studies sexual behavior and family formation. He's the author of 2 books on the sexual behavior of teenagers and young adults. He's the author of the Family Structures Study, published in Social Science Research in 2012, and has written about data collection and polling on same-sex parenting, as well as ways same-sex marriage may shape the wider mating market. Professor Regnerus.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to be with you today. It should be obvious to us that the family and marriage in particular is under a great deal of popular and political scrutiny of late, more than we might have imagined as recently as 10 or 15 years. And there's a tug of war in the social sciences, too, over what we know with confidence about the contemporary family, which has not changed a great deal over time, and what can be said about it, and who can say it. But while scholarly norms, language, and state and federal family law can shift with remarkable speed, as they have in the West over a short few decades, the data collected from thousands of regular people who are living or have lived in all manner of household structures and family experiences has not changed nearly so fast as the law. The empirical evidence still documents the pivotal importance of family stability and well-being in social life. Where we see children and young adults flourishing best, you are apt to see stable families as well. The family remains the first building block, necessary but not sufficient in any large, decent, dynamic, and sustainable social order. Not everybody has to be in one for that to be accomplished, but there has to be that stable family in the culture. But some people want to say, well, isn't the family just a social construction? Can it be what we wish it to be? Much is made of the socially constructed nature of the family. In fact, calling something socially constructed is a very popular theme in sociology. And it has some merit. Most aspects of social life and the institutions within or under which we live are social constructions, by which we mean that people made them. And for them to continue, we have to remake them and reinforce them regularly. But calling the family simply a social construction is an effort to undermine the reality of it and to suggest that its structure and its functions could be radically different or not exist at all, and we would be okay. But there are some common and permanent characteristics of the family. There's a structure that is historically reliable, and that when it functions competently, doesn't have to function great, good enough. When it functions good enough, it can't be topped in its accomplishment of 6 key tasks. Families make things. They make money, they make products, etc. They reproduce themselves. They socialize their children. They do things together, recreation. They guard sexual access to family members, sometimes very tightly, other settings rather negligently. And they take care of ill and aging family members. Historically, these 6 functions varied little, even as we recall or witness examples of individuals and even whole communities who seemed more or less good at some aspects of these. For example, contemporary Americans often outsource the care of elderly family members due to the necessity, such as employment obligations or excessive expense. On the way down here this morning, I visited my mother-in-law in a nursing home. We've outsourced that, but not without some degree of guilt and concern. While plenty of families prioritize shared evening meals, other families don't. Some parents oversee the dating activities of their adolescent children carefully, or they curb them altogether, while other parents seem to show very little interest in discerning their youth's romantic and sexual activities. Some outsourcing, like sending children to daycare, can and may be uneventful in its immediate consequences. Other outsourcing, like reproduction or sexual control, is considered to be far more risky and problematic. Other hallmarks of the family are increasingly in question, including marriage itself. Much of the damage, I say, is self-inflicted. Marriage rates continue to drop precipitously among young adults ages 25 to 34. Oh, I must have struck that slide. Sorry. The sweet spot for marriage, ages 25 to 34. In 12 short years, the rate of those folks who are married has declined 13 percentage points. It used to be 55% in the year 2000. By 2012, it was down to 42%. 55 to 42 married. At the same time, the percentage who had never been married rose from 34 to 49%. It's an X. They've crossed each other in 12 years, and they're not bending yet. They're still heading well away from each other. It's a rather remarkably short period of time. Rather stunning. Alongside this flight from marriage is the legal and political debate about the structure of the marital union itself. Is marriage socially constructed to such an extent that its basic structure is malleable, subject to collective will? Can a marriage be comprised by two men or two women? Few believed so prior to about 30 years ago. Now majority opinion has shifted in the West. Americans are still divided on the matter, including youth. Nobody believes me on that. In a report due out in a few weeks from nationally representative data, 26% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24, it's like a quarter of 18 to 24-year-olds, when asked whether same-sex marriage should be legal, said, I neither agree with that statement nor disagree with that statement. They're neutral, right? But neutral people tend to lean towards the positive. But we often think that youth have already made up their mind about this subject. I'm not sure it's true. The legal system, on the other side, seems rather sure of itself. They're very keen on affirming the new malleability in the structure of marriage. But the roots of where we're at today really lay in the development of reproductive technology more than anything else. Certainly more than the emergence of new rights. I'm always a big believer in the idea that technology drives structural change, which echoes in culture. Culture basically is the last to know or to feel social change. British social theorist Anthony Giddens said in his landmark 1992 book, The Transformation of Intimacy, that the sexual revolution began with effective contraception, which in his words, he said, it meant more than an increased capability of limiting pregnancy. It meant more than that. In combination with other influences affecting family size, it signaled a deep transition in personal life. For women, and in a partly different sense for men, this is Giddens talking, sexuality became malleable, open to being shaped in diverse ways, something one could cultivate, and a potential property of the individual. Now that conception can be artificially produced rather than just artificially inhibited, Giddens says sexuality is at last fully autonomous. Fully autonomous, meaning separated from embeddedness in strong relationships, separated from embeddedness in romantic relationships. Giddens then says you should expect more change. He said once there's a new terminology for understanding sexuality, ideas, concepts, and theories couched in these terms start to seep into social life itself and help reorganize and reorder it. And we're in the middle of that reorganizing and reordering right now. Giddens goes on. The sexual revolution of the past 30 or 40 years, he said, it's not even primarily a gender-neutral advance in sexual permissiveness. He said it involves two basic elements, one of which, he argued, is the flourishing of homosexuality, male and female. So Giddens takes an arrow and he draws it from contraception to malleability to homosexuality. I didn't say it, but it makes sense. If I said it, I'd get in trouble for it. A secular British social theorist says it, and he's a genius. You shouldn't be ashamed to say it either. What Westerners have witnessed over the past several decades, then, is not so much the social construction of marriage and family toward different plausible ends as a product of political and legal will. What we've seen is the reality of technology-driven social change, which brings new social structures which then act back upon the phenomena that gave rise to them. What has emerged in the domain of sex and relationships is not simply different norms or values, but restructured realities around the intimate life. We now value what Giddens called the pure relationship. He's not talking about purity in some sort of religious sense. He's talking about a pure relationship where a social relation is entered into for its own sake, not instrumentally, not with regard to consequences. It's entered into its own sake for what can be derived by each person from a sustained association with that other person. And it's continued only insofar as thought by both parties to deliver enough satisfactions for each individual to stay within it. It's the pure relationship. What Giddens said back in 1992 is that in a time where childbearing can be avoided amidst a rich and varied sexual life, what would likely result is in fact what has resulted 25 years later. We have strong norms about emotional and physical satisfaction in relationships, great expectations about them. Expectations of paired sexual activity emerge quickly in budding relationships. In the slide I won't show today, in the report that's coming out in a few weeks, we see sort of a bimodal, a two-point frequency of when the sex first began in a relationship, before it or when you got married. Isn't that weird? Before it or when you got, that's the modal where Americans report sex being introduced into their relationship. Sexual exclusivity is no longer assumed. You have to talk about it. You have to negotiate it. Shorter-term relationships are the norm, together with this perception that people are commitment phobic. I actually don't think it's true. Plastic sexuality. Sexual interests and directions are explored, shaped, remodeled, and an obsession with romance. Yet stability seems increasingly elusive. To younger Americans, maybe not so much on this campus, but on many campuses, to young Americans, I would just say these things and they'd be like, that's new? That's the reality they know. Giddens cautions, though, saying that, quote, it would not be right to suppose that childhood has remained unaffected by these new realities in parental romantic relationships. That's an understatement. Listen to that again. It would certainly not be right to suppose that childhood has remained unaffected. It's a very passive sentence, a very loaded sentence. Wouldn't be right to suppose that childhood has remained unaffected. So how can we know? Prior to 2010, 4 short years ago, very little population-based data analyses of same-sex households with children were even available. Several, however, have emerged since then. So data collection in this realm has expanded notably, which is a very good thing. But what these data say about same-sex households with children and how exactly such data ought to be analyzed has been the subject of significant emotional and political contest. The publication of my 2012 journal article on the comparative outcomes of adult children who report having had a parent who had a same-sex relationship stirred a hornet's nest, to put it mildly. I used data from nearly 3,000 people, 248 of whom reported their parent having had a same-sex relationship at some time during their growing up years. I documented, I'm not going to go through it at great length here, I documented that those for whom that was the case were more likely to have endured a more difficult childhood and a more difficult adulthood than kids who grew up with a stable, married mother and father. This is for the maternal same-sex relationships. This is for the paternal ones, the differences. My purpose in doing that study, I'm not going to explore it in detail today, my purpose in doing it was to evaluate the basic scholarly claim that there are no differences in outcomes between kids who grew up in same-sex households and kids who grew up with a married mother and father. And not everything is different between those who grew up in a stably intact household and those who don't. It's to be expected. But across different types of measures, the benefits of having grown up with a married biological mother and father who are still together, or they were until one of them or both of them passed away, were obvious. Vengeance was swift. There was a near instant demand for the scholarly journal to retract the publication, which has not occurred because the results are neither erroneous nor fabricated. A letter of 200 scholars against me within 2 days of its publication. The APA figured they should denounce me on day 2, right? So much for slow and thoughtful processes. Hostile blogs updated daily for weeks and months. 15 Freedom of Information Act requests for my correspondence related to the project. Hostile people emailing all my colleagues, my dean, denouncing the University of Texas for employing me, etc. The journal editor himself was virtually assaulted online, and his university was sued. I learned that stating apparent but unpopular things on sensitive subjects can be rather expensive. On the bright side, it turned scholars' attention, maybe for the first time, maybe not for long, to the limitations of the social science in this area. My study, of course, had limitations. Everyone's does. I wasn't able to track the lives of very many children who grew up in long-term same-sex households because stability was uncommon. Some suggested it was unfair of me to compare stability with what amounted in reality to instability. But what if instability was a common experience for children in such households? It reminds me of a story told to me by a friend of mine at the University of Colorado. He lives next door to a woman, a mother, who's been through 3 same-sex romantic relationships in the past few years that they've been neighbors. The professor told me that he'd be out in the backyard with his kids playing, only to notice the neighbor's son peering over the fence, watching what was going on. The boy's mother is aware of this and says to the neighbor, the friend of mine, "I'm doing the best I can." Some suggest that this mother's situation will invariably improve with greater social acceptance and legal rights. It's hard to say. Hers, however, is not the popular face of the movement. Instead, we see a well-adjusted child of a 30-something upper-middle-class white mother and her partner, a child born by assisted reproductive technology. That is what scholars, judges, and the media have demanded as a comparison category. It's as if they watched too much television and insisted the world look like their ideal. I admit I didn't have the numbers of stably coupled female households to assess them in a very large, nationally representative study. It raises the question, though, whether the average experience within such households is something quite different from the ideal experience. Meanwhile, I've seen no documentable change in how same-sex couples come to have children. And the population most apt to use artificial means, white women, are the population statistically least interested in having children, according to data from the National Study of Family Growth. And ART is expensive. It's not that common. It's out of reach of most. So the ideal image is a very elitist one. Even this, the matter of what counts as a same-sex household, especially one with children, is far from settled science. Should we only compare those households that have two parents? How long should the parents have been together? Must the children know about their parents' sexuality? And what should scientists do about the household instability that has been and may still be quite commonly associated with same-sex households? Do we ignore it? Do you denounce any suggestions that it's relevant or perhaps even common? Or, has typically been the case, do you control for it in regression models, relying on the assumption that instability is randomly distributed when it may not be? I hold, and I continue to do so in spite of opposition, that the answers to these questions are not simple. I've been repeatedly told that my study violated protocols in the study of same-sex household outcomes. There is no obvious protocol. In reality, I suspect every scholar who works with population-based data about same-sex couples, persons, parents, and households knows that the underlying story varies little between nationally representative data sets. What varies widely is the manner in which different scholars, myself included, have chosen to analyze and interpret that data. Despite competent analyses, plausible interpretations of the population-based data available, economists Doug Allen, Joe Price of BYU, and myself were said to have been representing a fringe viewpoint, and hence largely unbelievable by a Michigan federal court judge back in the spring. But are the arguments that we raised there in Michigan, and which you've heard here today, really so odd or unseemly? I frankly don't see it. They are legitimate questions, but we're being criticized for not doing the decent thing and keeping quiet. The NFSS, this data, however, is hardly the only data source that suggests that there could be problems. There's new analyses of the mini waves of the National Health Information Survey. They note it too, especially regarding emotional well-being measures. But expect social scientists to do their best, however, to paper it over or explain it away by adding more and more control variables until it goes away. And if they don't succeed, there's always a blistering blogosphere happy to remind people of the costs of disobedience and disloyalty to the cause. How do you do sociology in such an environment? It's not easy. Sociology assumes a particular good that formally goes unspoken. It has its shared compass. The wider movement around this subject has been a very popular one among social scientists. Few social scientists have or express any concerns about making civil marriage available to same-sex couples who wish to access it. Likewise, few express concerns about possible ramifications of esteeming, not just tolerating like we do with single parents, esteeming the notion of motherless or fatherless children in same-sex couple households. Just this morning, the New York Times features a one-sided debate, how common is that, about whether it should be okay to change your sex on your birth certificate. Your birth certificate. And why do we collect data about individuals' sex anyway? Let's just drop the male-female question. It should be irrelevant. Many sociologists may roll their eyes at such a question, but few are going to wade in to contest such silliness. They have their professional credibility to worry about. I've learned some things, though. First, you can survive. You can even thrive amid hostility. I've learned that there is still such a thing as called academic freedom. And when you realize that your professional status within sociology has likely peaked, it's quite freeing. I really don't care what my peers think about an article I write, or if I write an amicus brief. Will it affect my next faculty evaluation? Maybe. I no longer care. It's actually what academic freedom and tenure were for. I think we forget about that. Too many of us consider it tenure basic job security that is afforded to nobody else in the whole world except us because somehow we deserve it. It has a purpose. It was created to sustain the pursuit of the truth wherever it would lead you. We sociologists operate under the false assumption that a sociological perspective on human social behavior will invariably lead us to commend more and greater freedom, rights, equalities, regardless of the domain in question. Instead, that's the arc of a Western sociology devoid of a compelling anthropology of human personhood and community. What are people is a question we ought to ask. The dominant answer to that unasked question is like, whatever they wish to be. What ought people to do is answered with whatever they wish to do, so long as no immediate or significant harm is done to themselves or to those around them. We're going to talk about the definition of harm later. These are all answers that don't bode well for the long-term sustainable reproduction of flourishing human societies. So as a result, tradition is under suspicion, which is really ironic given the long-standing interest within sociology of the study of ethnic culture and codes. The ways of the Irish Catholic or the black Chicagoan used to be fodder for some of the most famous and fascinating sociological study. By and large, that's starting to recede. But what would replace tradition, collective culture, and code after we deem them burdensome and conformist? Well, all we've got left is the imperative, and it feels like that, the imperative of creating and expressing a personal culture. The solidarity that the Irish, or African Americans, or women, or Catholics once felt toward each other is dissolving. We're on our own now, it would seem, since kinship, neighborhood, faith, and common culture can no longer be counted upon and are openly being undermined. You invent yourself, pick your sex, your gender expression, your faith, you name it. It's actually a very remarkable, destructive burden to persons, resulting in an explosion of fragile associations requiring our management rather than our reliance. No wonder we fear giving offense. What we've constructed in place of tradition is so unbelievably fragile that it requires new norms, new rules, new laws even to prop it up. And thus we spend far more time reinventing ourselves, seeking some sort of promised freedom that does not materialize because it cannot materialize. Instead of resting, even uncomfortably, in social structures not of our own making, we can't rest at all. For the self, the primal unit of postmodern society, requires renewal and remaking and always the pursuit of acceptance and love. Amid all this new dynamism, Social theorist Margaret Archer remarks, there's no growth in real personal differentiation, and thus in the heterogeneity of the population. It's true. We're not really creating genuinely interesting diversity, only rumors of it, facades of it. It's largely a masquerade. In reality, it is about fashioning sameness, the McDonaldization of human culture. So there seem to be two key hopes among those who welcome same-sex marriage, and they're pretty distinctive kinds of hopes. The first is that it would stabilize the relationships and perhaps the families of those same-sex couples that get married. Another quite different hope is that it makes marriage less necessary in general. That this is a signal that we no longer need a marrying culture. There are two quite different hopes, of course, and we will see how each hope fares because the reality is nearing. No one disputes that same-sex households have historically displayed greater breakup rates compared to opposite sex, especially married households. Why this is the case is not often discussed, apart from the assumption that legal same-sex marriage is going to cure that. Any claims about the likely persistence of this empirical phenomenon are dismissed as either irrelevant or mean-spirited. But I've weighed in with an argument that suggests we shouldn't presume gay and straight marriages will fare just like opposite-sex marriages. Some will, plenty won't. Why not? Two reasons, two very basic reasons. Men are men and women are women. And I'm not convinced that the experience of homosexuality really alters that at a primal level. I don't think it does. Two sociologists who examined the same-sex parenting literature back in the year 2000, they noted statistically higher breakup rates among lesbian couples, even in non-probability samples where you can almost pick your own sample. They reason, in explaining this, they reason that not only do same-sex couples, in this case women, lack the institutional pressures and support for commitment that marriage provides, but qualitative studies suggest that they tend to embrace comparatively high standards of emotional intimacy and satisfaction. Okay? High standards of emotional intimacy and satisfaction. Of course women do this. My wife does this. Her standards for emotional connection are higher than mine. Absolutely. But the difference is she's married to a man, a fact that forces her to navigate difference. She's married to someone who does not exhibit comparable standards around emotion, who has to be coaxed and taught to value them and express them. And the reverse is true. I'm not married to a man, meaning that she will fail to value some of those things that I wish she would value more. I'm not going to talk about what those are. Hence, what you would expect from marriages between women are exactly what social scientists find. Greater valuing of emotional intimacy, greater preference for egalitarianism in the relationship, a decline in sexual frequency over time, and higher breakup rates. And marriage between men, what do we find? Less concern for egalitarianism, less concern for emotional intimacy, more frequent sexual behavior, and a lower bar to extramarital liaisons. Completely in step with what anyone should expect from men, not because they're gay, but because they're men. It reveals that marriage between man and woman, for all its historical cultural diversity, exhibits traits just less apt to be consistently seen in same-sex relationships. And that is navigating sexual difference, learning to love and to like someone quite different from you. Long-standing marriages, 30, 40 plus years, especially those with children, are less likely to model what Giddens predicted about the pure relationship. In part because so many of those marriages remain complementary, in their gender role distinctions, and hence more functional than symbolic. Sociologist Andrew Cherlin talks about this turn toward the symbolic meaning of marriage, and it's almost ubiquitous. It's in step with the pure relationship that Giddens talks about. But long-standing marriages, you're going to find more function than symbol in their marital meaning. While certainly such marriages are becoming a minority quickly, they will never become extinct. Social scientists should expect this pure relationship to characterize more same-sex than opposite-sex unions in any era. And Giddens explicitly said that. He said they are the vanguards of the pure relationship model. So while the first hope that same-sex marriages will be more secure than cohabitation is likely to be realized, absolutely, it doesn't mean that the second hope, this receding of a marriage culture, will not also occur at the same time. We may not notice, however, because the receding of a marriage culture happens when there's a loss of shared assumptions about what marriage is and what it means. And that, as Giddens warned us back in 1992, that's been happening for decades. It raises questions about marriage itself. How central is sexual fidelity to the meaning of marriage? Can spouses cut deals with each other about sleeping with other people? Is that still a marriage? How central are children to the meaning of marriage? How should you have them? Should you control all aspects of childbearing? Are egalitarian ideals, equality, is it sensible within the average marriage in the United States and the average marriage in the world? Does scorekeeping foster happiness in relationships? In the end, nobody is trying to prevent adults who profess love for each other from being together. I wouldn't dream of contesting that. The question remains, what is marriage? And what ought communities esteem? And why? One of the reasons so many people have been unprepared to answer these kinds of questions is because there was never a need to for millennia. Forming a stable, sexually complementary partnership was how people survived and how cultures continued. These are really quite new questions, ones that only technological development of the last 50 years enabled. No pill, no in vitro fertilization, I'm not up here talking to you. In the end, the cultural turn away from the biological family in the academy and in the legal community is really quite remarkable. Even while the evidence for its strengths is incontrovertible and its costs are borne by communities that it's obvious, it is increasingly politically unpalatable to go to bat for the nuclear family while the pitched battle about the emergence of new family forms and meanings rages on. So the legal squabble over some of these things may be drawing to a close soon. But I think the cultural contest may just be beginning. Thank you.